Noah's faith was outstanding. He lived in an evil world, a world dominated by materialized angels, their violent offspring, and a society of ungodly people. Noah lacked many of the things we have today to help us keep our faith strong. He had no Bible to help him to love Jehovah and to understand his ways. He didn't know about all the faithful men and women who would live after him. And Noah had no congregation of fellow believers to encourage him and to strengthen his faith. Yet Noah knew much. He knew what happened in the Garden of Eden, and he could see the tragic results. He saw that people grew old and died. He knew that the way to the Garden of Eden was barred, and the ground outside had been cursed.
This is a really good example of the governing body or faithful slave, God's channel with mankind, straying from the facts and indulging in pure speculation. So we've just heard Tony Morris say,
"Yet Noah knew much." He knew what happened in the Garden of Eden, and he could see the tragic results. He saw that people grew old and died. He knew that the way to the Garden of Eden was barred, and the ground outside had been cursed.
If we take the Noah story at face value, and we shouldn't, but if we were to do that, it would be fair to say Noah likely knew about the Garden of Eden. Noah likely knew about the way into the Garden of Eden being barred or the ground being cursed. But you can't emphatically say that Noah did know about these things if it doesn't say so in the Genesis narrative. In other words, what Tony Morris is doing is putting words in the mouths of the Bible writers, because it's quite conceivable, again, if we take the Noah story at face value, it's quite conceivable that Noah didn't know any of those things. It's quite conceivable that people hadn't told him about the Garden of Eden, or the ground being cursed, or the gates to the Garden of Eden being barred. It's conceivable that he could be ignorant of all of those things, and the Noah narrative would still make sense. Granted, it's a fairly small point in light of the horrendous stuff we've just witnessed earlier in Storytime with Uncle Tony, but it's worth flagging because this is supposed to be a wise group of spiritual gurus, the governing body, who base everything they have to say on the scriptures, and yet here we have a clear example of them indulging in speculation and stating speculation as though it's fact.
Noah had long wondered how Jehovah would act against an ungodly world. Now he knew. A catastrophic flood would cleanse the earth. Noah also knew what he and his family must do. So much depended on him. The thought must have been overwhelming. The ark would be gigantic. Now, new questions occupied his mind. Trees. A great many trees would have to be felled and the timber hauled, shaped, and joined. How would he do that? How would he gather so many kinds of animals? How would he get food supplies for the animals and for his family? And what about the godless people around him? What would they think? No one knew what had happened to the righteous men who preceded him. Abel had been killed by his brother Cain, and Enoch likely was in such danger of being slain by ungodly ones that God mercifully cut his life short so that he wouldn't fall into their hands.
Yes, God mercifully cut Enoch's life short to stop the ungodly ones from cutting Enoch's life short. Well, what can I say? More material that's completely inappropriate for children. You have there a visual being shown to children of one guy with a massive stick who's just bludgeoned to death his brother. This apparently is suitable for Jehovah's Witness children to sit through, as is that stuff about Enoch running for his life. Nothing terrifying or fear-inducing about all of this stuff. And that's before we even get to this totally cringe-worthy stuff about, oh, there must have been so much work for Noah to do. He had so many problems. He needed to fell all those trees and machine all that lumber. He needed to find the animals. He needed to find food for himself and the animals. The more he carries on with all of these questions and all of these issues that would have been serious logistical problems for Noah, actually, not just serious logistical problems, that's putting it mildly, impossible logistical problems. Because we're talking about, I think, 6 million land-dwelling species being crammed into a box. And not just any box, a box so big that it would have been bigger than any wooden ocean-going vessel, so big, in fact, that it would have broken up on the high seas. We know this through shipbuilding. This was actually pointed out in a debate between Ken Ham, who, like Tony Morris, is a biblical creationist. Ken Ham and Bill Nye, the science guy. Bill Nye pointed this out in the debate. The dimensions of the ark just don't work. If it's made purely from wood, it would have broken up on the high seas, subjected to the stresses and strains of the ocean. Whichever way you approach this story, whichever detail you zero in on, the whole thing unravels when it's subjected to even the slightest bit of logic. And yet here we have Tony Morris in the 21st century describing this as though it's a historical event, as though it really happened. This is not just comical in terms of how ignorant and uninformed this man is. It's frankly dangerous. It's frankly detrimental to all of the young minds in the audience who are hearing this and thinking, oh yes, this totally happened. This is a historical event. I should believe that all of these things transpired. No, they didn't. And it's setting young minds back to make them believe this totally unfeasible story that collapses when subjected to the slightest scrutiny.
It took a long time for Noah's family to build the ark, perhaps some 40 or 50 years. There must have been challenges, but we never read that Noah complained. The family had no support from others. Remember that Jesus said that the people took no note until the flood came and swept them all away. Of course, people took note that Noah was building an ark. His neighbors must have asked him why he was building such an enormous structure. And Noah explained to them why he was building it. But Noah's contemporaries took no note that Jehovah was blessing Noah and his construction efforts. They took no note of what this would mean for them. Instead, the people were caught up in everyday affairs, eating, drinking, and marrying. Those were the things that concerned them. To those godless people, Noah and his family were fools, crackpots. They were the butt of ridicule, jeers, and probably threats. The ark was finally completed. We can imagine Noah and his family looking at it with pride and remembering how God had helped them. Jehovah always directs his servants when needed.
It's really fascinating for me to see Tony retelling this, again, totally implausible Noah story in such a way that Jehovah's Witnesses can relate to. He's putting a clear Jehovah's Witness spin on this. For example, he says,
but Noah's contemporaries took no note that Jehovah was blessing Noah and his construction efforts.
Yes, if you think about it, Noah's Ark was a construction project. just like Jehovah's Witnesses have construction projects, because it turns out that the almighty creator of all things needs buildings, especially now, on the cusp of Armageddon, when the entire world is going to undergo dramatic destruction and carnage and buildings being leveled. Especially now, God needs his people to build stuff, to build assembly halls, to build branch facilities, to build kingdom halls, all coincidentally to the benefit of Tony Morris and his pals. So for me, there's a clear spin on this. He's trying to reinvent the Noah story in a way that Jehovah's Witnesses will relate to and in a way that reinforces the priorities of the governing body in the 21st century. He also says,
to those godless people, Noah and his family were fools, crackpots. They were the butt of ridicule, jeers, and probably threats.
Well, that's clearly been worked in so that Jehovah's Witnesses will nod along and think, yeah, that's exactly how people react when we tell them that the world is ending, that God's destruction is imminent, and that they need to join our religion or they'll be destroyed. That's the way they react when we say that. So, whoa, there's a connection here. If that's how people were reacting to Noah, then it makes sense that they're reacting that way to us as well. Just as they thought Noah and his family were crackpots, they seem to think we're crackpots too. Therefore, yes, I can see where this is going.
If Noah had wondered how he would collect all those animals, he now knew. They would come to him. Jehovah would bring them. Noah didn't have to go looking for them. The animals did come. Every kind of animal, some by sevens and some by twos. Just imagine dozens and dozens of animals strutting, hopping, slithering, and waddling into the ark. We can imagine Noah's family finding places for them all, stroking the soft fur of some animals as they passed, while avoiding the rough hides or spines of others and making sure to get out of the way of the large animals as they lumbered past. The birds came too, fluttering, soaring. What colors, what smells, what sounds. Noah and his family must have shouted to hear one another above the din.
This is where Storytime with Uncle Tony is getting truly ridiculous. And just to be absolutely clear, some of you may be wondering whether I added that quirky music. No, that's the original music from the convention. It's almost as though the people editing this video themselves realize how preposterous this whole thing is. I mean, really. 6.5 million species is what you would need to fit into that wooden box in order to repopulate the planet. And that's assuming, of course, that none of the animals eat each other inside the ark, and that immediately on disembarking the ark, the animals don't eat each other before they can reproduce. So, in other words, it's completely impossible. And of course, creationists get round this whole thing by saying, oh, well, it wasn't species, it was kinds. And it's not just Jehovah's Witnesses who say this, of course. It's the likes of Ray Comfort and Ken Ham, young earth creationists who also believe in a literal globe-encompassing Noah's flood. I actually dealt with the whole thing rather than repeat myself too much. I dealt with the whole thing in my book, The Reluctant Apostate, and I want to read you a footnote from a box on pages 29 and 30 titled Noah's Flood, because in my book I put boxes specifically for Jehovah's Witnesses because the book is written mostly for a non-Jehovah's Witness audience. But anyway, in this box titled Noah's Flood, there's a footnote that says, Insight on the Scriptures, Volume 1, is understandably vague on how many representative kinds boarded the ark to repopulate the planet. a number of only 100 is put forward that, quote, could have produced the variety of species known today. Other creationists, like Ken Ham, are more generous, suggesting that 7,000 kinds accomplished this feat, even if we take this larger figure to suggest that 7,000 kinds ballooned into 6.5 million land-dwelling species in only 4,400 years requires an intensity and speed of natural selection that would baffle scientists. We would see, on average, approximately 1,500 new species evolving every year. You can see the problem here. Ironically, by sticking to the Noah story, creationists like Toni Morris, who insist that evolution is, quote, a false teaching, unknowingly support evolution to the extent of suggesting that life evolves faster than even scientists will allow.